Hello and welcome to the EV Charging Podcast, where we take you behind the scenes of the electric vehicle charging industry in Australia and all around the world. I'm Daniel Carson.
And I'm Jeff Sykes.
And we're your hosts from Solar Choice, your go-to trusted independent advisor for all things clean energy in residential, commercial and strata buildings. In this week's episode, we interview Paul Fox, the co-founder and chief strategy officer at Evie Networks. Some of our listeners will know Evie Networks because you've probably used their chargers. Evie is one of the leading public charging infrastructure companies in Australia, with fast charging sites all over the country, including some with speeds up to 350 kilowatts. Paul has had a super interesting career, from starting businesses to building businesses, and even being in Silicon Valley during the dot-com boom. Paul was generous enough to share some insights from the early days of the industry in Australia, when it was really just finding its feet, and share some cool stories from different stages of his career. Here's our interview with Paul.
So welcome to the EV Charging Podcast. We are very lucky today to be joined by Paul Fox. Paul is the co-founder and current chief strategy officer of leading DC fast charging platform Evie. Earlier in his career, Paul was an engineer spending time building infrastructure in developing nations, including South Africa in the 80s. It must have been quite a time. Since then, Paul has progressed through a series of strategy consulting roles, CEO roles, participating in venture capital as an investor and on board roles, including a 14-year stint in Silicon Valley during the tech boom. Paul, we could probably spend this entire podcast diving into your personal history and your career. So thank you for agreeing to being on the podcast, and welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and long-time fan. I sort of been following the solar panel index for quite a while. So one of my favourite reads to see where it is today. And, you talk about some of the history there, but I remember, looking at forecasts for panel prices, and I was investing in solar startups, and people saying, it'll be below $1 a kilowatt, and people were saying, no, never. But, here we are today, and it's still going down. Yeah.
And it seems that EVs could be on the same trajectory from, over 100,000 a few years ago down to what's the cheapest one?
Absolutely. You can buy a great little EV now for less than the price of a Corolla, a hybrid Corolla. You can walk out the door today and do that. So, and it will follow a very similar trajectory because it's driven by basic economics. And, we used to talk about a dollar a watt, fully installed price for solar, and that being a figure of merit that we would reach one day. Well, for electric vehicle batteries, it's $100 per kilowatt hour at the pack level. What that means is it is now possible for electric vehicles, to be at price parity with petrol vehicles. So we're here.
Yeah,
so,
and maybe you can give us some context, because that might be the first time some people listening have heard that idea of dollars per kilowatt hour in a battery. Yeah. Where were we 2 years ago?
Well, let me tell you where we were in 2010, because 2010 is when the Nissan Leaf came out. Yeah. And that was the top seller in Australia until the Tesla Model S showed up. And at that time, it was $1,000 per kilowatt hour. So basically, it's 10 times lower today. And, it's an asymptotic sort of, sorry, I'm an engineer, you can tell. The price falls quickly and then it levels out, but we're still at a point where it's leveling out. And that's just on the trajectory of lithium-ion batteries, massive production scale. Doesn't matter about lithium prices because lithium's less than 1% of the total battery. So, those material costs are important, but mainly it's about scale in manufacturing.
Yeah, so just to make that real, typical EV, or my EV has a 60 kilowatt hour battery. Yeah. So at $1,000 a kilowatt hour, that's $60,000 just for the battery.
Yeah.
And, today's prices that's down at $6,000 for the battery, which enables these, like you said, Corolla-priced electric vehicles come on the market.
And what happens too, though, is that bigger, heavier vehicles have bigger, heavier batteries. And so the small cars are at price parity now, And then over time, as the cost keeps coming down, bigger batteries get cheaper. And so you see the larger vehicles start to electrify or become total cost of ownership parity. Right. We, back in at the start of COVID, so that was sort of March 2020, I think. And so around then, not long before that, we launched a fleet of cars, electric cars, Hyundai Ioniqs, that we were renting out to Uber drivers. And we thought, we can make this work now. We're going to prove it to everyone. And then if everyone does it, they'll buy electricity from our charging stations. So we bought these 7 cars and we started renting them out to Uber drivers. Well, then COVID hit. Things slowed down a little bit. We had to extend a little bit of credit to our friendly Uber drivers. But those cars we would rent them out to drivers for $450 a week, everything including, the car, the insurance, and the fuel. Right. And some of the times these drivers would spend a couple of $100 a week just in petrol. Right. And so it was because they did such high kilometers, it worked for them really well. And now Uber drivers are one of the biggest group of drivers on our network. We don't rent cars to them anymore. We leave that to Splend and Hertz and Avis and other players.
So look, let's rewind a little bit, Paul. So you started your career as an engineer, I understand, and working sort of around the world in various developing countries.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is true, but I read somewhere that there is a bridge named after you in Papua New Guinea.
Simbu province.
Is there a story behind that?
Yeah. So I was working on, very long story short, but I was attached to the PNG Defence Force Engineer Battalion. There was a particular project in the highlands in Simbu province. And essentially what it did is it gave, dozens of villages access to market and kids access to school and so forth, because otherwise there was this massive ravine with a timber bridge over it, like literally a log with some vines either side that they would, so people fall off it or it would get washed away. And so that was our job, to connect these up so, people can bring their coffee to market, they can afford to send their kids to school. But yeah, so it was quite a challenging project. The guys got it done. And for the grand opening, they had a big sing-sing, which is everyone dresses up in traditional costumes and so forth, and the singing and dancing and so forth. And they invited me to come down. And
great. And so from there, looking through, you somehow made your way to Silicon Valley in what must have been one of the best times.
Boom.
The rise of Google, the rise of Apple in those years. And I've heard some stories of the overnight billionaires and the lavish parties.
Literally, when we arrived there, it was literally like that. And I was doing electronics manufacturing. So we were making printers and mobile phones and so forth for the big players. So Hewlett-Packard did printers in those days. So, I think they still do, yeah. Mm-hmm. Motorola phones, that's kind of still around. But you'd sort of show up to a meeting with a customer and there'd be a young engineer and he'd say, listen, I've got a hard stop at 3 because I've got to go and pick up my Porsche. Okay. Probably, 2 years later, he wouldn't have been able to pay the insurance, because it went up and up. There was a huge build out in fiber. Money was flowing, and then it's literally stopped like that. And we managed to sell our company prior to the whole thing collapsing. But then I joined, this bigger entity that acquired us, and sort of saw it from the inside, where we had a jumbo jet full of obsolete parts that were going to be made into routers that kind of got shipped from Mexico back to California, because what were you going to do with $1 billion worth of chips that you couldn't sell anymore? And now Google got funded. So that was 99, 2000, 2001. So Google got their funding in 2003. And that was the bottom of that recession. And, now they're, one of the biggest companies in the world. And so, it was not plain sailing for them. And that, I think for me, says something about any of these markets, and development of electric vehicles and so forth. It's the same sort of thing as there's going to be a lot of adversity on the way. There's going to be ups and downs along the way. But,
you must have come across a number of sort of that sort of money always attracts interesting talents, and particularly, I guess, with it being technology focused, there would have been sort of some interesting dynamics playing out in the social scenes.
Yeah, it is a really interesting place to live and work because everybody believes that anything can be done. But also it is more possible to do that because you have a concentration of money and talent and so forth. So, I lived on a little cul-de-sac and it was just it looked like Canberra. In Canberra streets, there's no front fences, bungalows, all the kids are running around the street. And 4 or 5 of the families there had family members that had been executives and been through IPOs and started startups. Right. And so it's in the air, it's around you. And then certainly in 2014, when I was there, 13 houses in the cul-de-sac, 5 electric vehicles in driveways.
Wow. 10 years ago.
Yeah, 10 years ago. And it just, so we're sort of catching up with California in that regard. So we got acquired by this big American company. I thought, what am I going to do next? And I'd been doing energy type stuff prior to that adventure. And I thought, we'll get into energy tech. And so that's kind of met a big Texan guy called Woody from Paris, Texas. And we started, some different companies doing distributed generation. We did one in micro turbines, like 60 kilowatt micro turbines. We did a company doing fuel cells, hydrogen fuel cells. So I know a fair bit about hydrogen the hard way. And a smart grid company, like doing big surge suppressors on the grid. And so probably all a bit early because, clean energy really took off in 2006. That's kind of when the money started flowing in. Al Gore, Q-Cells, Suntech IPO, but also, Q-Cells, SunPower and Suntech. So Suntech, Shirong Zheng from UNSW. And that's sort of when they did their IPOs. And then all of a sudden the venture money went, whoa, what's this over here? Somewhere else to make money. And so it kind of got really quite exciting. And there was a lot of money invested, a lot of money blown. And that's kind of when I got in. I actually joined a venture capital fund because what happened is lots of billions went in, but the seed stage was getting ignored. And so I got involved in the creation of a seed stage venture capital fund. And so, saw it from the other side. I'd been trying to raise capital and build these companies, and now I got to see it from the other side as an investor.
Where and when did the Evie Networks journey begin?
So back in 2017, when I came back from the US, I spent a bit more time doing venture capital stuff, and then I joined AGL and tried to bring some Silicon Valley. And we did, I think we probably launched the first sort of commercial offering, mass market home batteries. We did VPPs. We did a bunch of cool stuff. But then the corporate antibodies started to gather around the innovation. It's very hard for big companies to innovate and change because they're sort of cannibalizing themselves in a sense. And so left AGL, got a call from a guy and he said, would you like to start an electric vehicle charging company? We'll fund you. Basically, that was and I was like, because I'd looked at it at AGL and I realized that it was, not hugely capital intensive, but quite capital intensive, but also would take quite a long time to build up. And, I sort of said, if you're a VC, this possibly isn't for you. He says, no, we're in it from the long haul. So that was the St. B Capital Fund. And I said, anyway, I'm taking 6 months off. Call me in 6 months, literally 6 months to the day. Ding, ding. Okay. And so, I met Trevor St. Baker, realized that he was in this for the long haul, that he really was doing it. And I said, let's do it. So I got started and then worked out. First, we had to work out what to do, how to do it. It wasn't initially obvious that the path we took was the path to take.
The path you took being public charging infrastructure?
No, well, we wanted to build public charging infrastructure. It was just what is the best business model to do it. And, it's interesting. At the same time, Tim Washington and Marty were starting ChargeFox, literally at the same time that was all happening. And they went for a particular model of sort of software billing systems aggregation. And we came to the conclusion that it had to be infrastructure. And so once realizing that, it was like, well, then how do you build such a business? So actually, first guy who joined us was Andrew Simpson, who's ex-Tesla guy and, really a brilliant engineer. And then sort of went looking for a CEO and called a friend and said, this is the sort of person I'm looking for, give me some advice. And he said, and then he said, actually, I'm thinking of coming back to Australia. Can I throw my hat in the ring? And I said, why not? And so Chris Mills joined, and I've known him since I was 18. So you
can trust him then?
You've
got all the dirt on him, probably.
No, exactly. Yeah. We know too much about each other. It's really too much about each other. So. And then he brought in people, I brought in people, and we grew over time. And so it takes time to build momentum. But he brought with him a lot of process and thinking out of telecoms. Like he deployed 50,000 odd telecom towers. Right. But it was more than that, because fine, go and hire some people from telecom. But what he used to do was travel around the world rescuing failing tower deployment projects. So if the equivalent of Optus or Telstra in the UK or Germany or whatever was absolutely way behind and in big trouble, they would call him and he'd sort of go in with his team and sort it out and get it back on track and so on. So, so there's a lot of ways of doing things. And that's kind of what's enabled us to build at the rate that we've built at.
Sounds like a core competency in problem solving, difficult issues.
It's process. And it's the same with reliability. Reliability is about process. It's about having systems, tools, partners. It's about what you track and how you manage it. And you can drive reliability, but you've got to be holding your own spares or have a partner that's basically holding spares on your behalf. It's very hard if you don't own the charger to maintain it. And that is the main reason why the owner-operator model makes sense, because then you are able to maintain reliability. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So if we look at the journey of Evie to where we are today from 2017, that must have been perhaps a little different to some of the previous ventures when in 2017 there was, a small handful of EVs on the road.
Yeah, less than 5,000, I think it was 4,000 or something. Yeah.
Wow. So you're really catering to a small market. I think, the exciting thing about EV charging is we know the masses are coming.
Yeah.
It's more a case of when, not if, but it probably has felt a little slower than you might have hoped. I think we all expected the transition to kick in at a greater pace at a sooner time in Australia.
What matters to us is cumulative vehicles on the road. A lot of media attention is on month-to-month sales. I don't care. As long as people buy thousands more cars each month, that's what matters to us, because it's the vehicles in operation, the number of vehicles actually on the road. So each month people buy more vehicles and it goes up and up and up. I think definitely there is there's some interesting factors at play at the moment, which are moving those month to months around. Remember, we're still ahead of where we were this time last year.
Of course, yeah.
I think there's a few things going on right now. One is the new vehicle efficiency standards, and that's kicking in. So that kicks in on the 1st of January. Yeah. And then units, you start having to report units on the 30th of June, I think, next year. And so there's a little bit of scurrying around at some of the OEMs about how to deal with that. One approach is sell as much as you can now. Yes. Get it under the wire. Yeah. And, because they've got massive factories in Thailand that are producing these, cars they can't really sell anywhere else in the world.
Right-hand drive vehicles?
Well, it's just the emission standards on those vehicles are so low that they can't sell it in the rest of the OECD.
Yes.
They can sell them to Russia, they can sell them to us, or they can sell them to the developing world. And so if you've got a big factory, you've got to cover the fixed costs. So you're going to try and push them out the door. So hence some manufacturers, I won't mention any names, Toyota, okay, are really pushing hard on hybrids because they're not ready with their electric vehicles yet. And also they want to get stuff in under the wire. So that's going on. So heavy advertising and so on of the hybrids. But electric vehicles are still a significant portion of those total sales.
So let's talk about DNSPs. So a reminder for the audience, distributed network service providers. It's the company that owns the poles and wires, effectively holding a regulated monopoly in different areas of Australia, running a national own and operate fast charging network. You'll be dealing with these companies almost on a daily basis. So
almost on an hourly basis would be probably more accurate.
So what we've heard, and look, you made a comment on the way into the studio today that different companies are having some experience with these networks becoming a bottleneck or becoming a, sort of a roadblock in the way of speeding up the EV transition.
Yeah.
So what's your experience been with these networks? And do you think something needs to change if we want to get to 10%, 20%, 50% of the vehicles on the road being EVs?
Yeah. So I guess a few different things to think about. One is in Australia, we have a very nice grid. Back in sort of the 2000s, we thought that air conditioners were going to overstress the grid and started spending heavily on the grid. As it turned out, the air conditioners sort of became 6 times more efficient than expected. And so the actual load was nowhere near as high as expected. But the benefit we got out of that was quite a resilient grid. If you compare ours to, say, California or most parts of Europe, we've got a pretty strong grid. So that's great news. I mean, obviously, there's lots of work to be done to manage power flows on that grid because now it's moving in all directions and so forth. But I think we benefit from that. There are 13 DNSPs across the country. We deal with all of them. And anyone that's, requested a connection, either property developers, solar developers, all this, and know that it is a long and sometimes arduous process to, get an application in, wait for it to come through the queue and so forth. And so that is no change. Perhaps what is different is the scale of the EV charging rollouts, because we are, we're not like a solar developer that does a few projects a year. Like we're doing, hundreds a year. And so lots and lots and lots of connections. And I think at the beginning, it was for the DNSPs, it was like very unfamiliar equipment. So they're asking us questions about, 18th order harmonics and things like that. And so we've got through all of that. Then each of the DNSPs, because they had to historically, dealing with connections could be done very simply in regional silos. So they'd split their patch up into sections maybe, or they'd split their patch up into different types or sizes of connections. So they create kind of a siloed sort of thing. And so what that meant was we would often be, to deal with the DNSP, we're talking to multiple different people. And then each time you talk to them, you've got to explain what an EV charger is, what the blah, 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 blah. So the best of the utilities have given us a single point of contact. They've trained their people. They've made efforts to improve that and have even, in some cases, been through a cycle of internal process improvement to actually improve connections process. Others, less so, shall we say. I think from our point of view, it is like we've kind of view ourselves as almost like a factory, a site factory. And this is part of the manufacturing process. And so, garbage in, garbage out. You've got to have good quality control in place through the process. And as long as you've got predictability in the process, you can manage it and you can maintain a good build rate. If you don't have good process, then you're going to be banging your head against the wall, going back to them backwards and forwards many, many times instead of sort of getting it right first time.
What sort of difference are we talking about in real terms if you're talking about a DNSP who's getting on board, making life a little bit easier, and those who are not? I mean, I think there'd be some listeners who are quite surprised by how long that process might be to get a new connection.
So the total time to get a site on air from the time that we have identified to going on air, well, could be anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. Okay. And when we started, process time was something like 18 to 24 months. And now it's nearer to 12. And that's not all grid connection time. It also includes things like doing feasibility and negotiating leases, all that sort of stuff. But a big part of the critical path there is getting that connection approved. and also getting it energized. At the moment, for example, we've got lots of sites sitting out there unenergized for various reasons. Either there's industrial action at the DNSP, or the DNSP is just not very good at energizing sites for whatever reason, and will literally wait. It'll be there, and they just don't get around to sending someone out to allow us to pull the lever. But yeah, it is a long time. And so anyone, if you started an electric vehicle charging company tomorrow, you'll be going well to get a site live within 2 years.
So the network's treating this as enough of a priority?
The leaders are, some of the others are just, maybe, it depends to what extent that they have realised how important it is to their business amongst all the other priorities they have, or, and there's other factors. We've got a real mix in Australia of investor-owned networks and government-owned networks. So in Queensland and Western Australia, they are, largely government-owned. In the rest of the country, they are lean towards being more privately owned. A lot of the private ones, but here's my view, is that if you electrify quickly, vehicle transportation quickly, you will push lots more kilowatt hours through the system. That will more quickly amortize the cost of the network and lower energy prices for everyone.
Yeah.
But what that also means for the DNSPs is their freedom to spend money, have the social license to spend money on network upgrades and earn a greater return is much higher. So the best thing they can do is very quickly put in place things, and I can talk about some of the things that they should be doing in place in order to get that process. And if you go to Europe and North America, you will see that the DNSP's equivalents have realised that and are right behind it. I think a lot of our networks now in Australia are still trying to look about how do they squeeze a bit of blood out of the stone rather than, making more stones. I don't know, it's a bad metaphor, isn't it?
It makes sense, though. It makes sense.
Yeah, so I think, you look at, in New South Wales, we have a bunch of DNSPs that are trying to get into curbside. Honestly, there is no natural monopoly in public charging. So why does the DNSP need to be involved in regulated public charging? It just doesn't make a lot of sense.
And of course, then they have an unfair advantage when companies such as yourself that are independent of the networks are competing against them.
That is the risk. Yeah, that is absolutely the risk. Yeah. And we've already seen cases where DNSPs have owned charges and have been offering pricing on that charges, which is lower than their own network tariffs. And so unless they're buying negatively priced wholesale electricity, we're not quite sure how they're doing that.
Yeah, it sounds concerning.
What's happening at the moment is the network tariffs are, as high as 60, 70% of our electricity costs are network tariffs. Why? Because we're on tariffs that were designed for a manufacturing company that, shows up in the morning, turns all the machines on, runs them for 2 shifts, turns them all off and goes home. We're not like that. Our load goes up and down like this. And so if a Porsche Taycan pulls into one of our stations and pulls, 250 odd kilowatts, then that will set the demand charge for the rest of the month. We can't turn around to the, MG3 owner and say, well, too bad, you got to pay for the Taycan this month. So we need a tariff that's designed for DC charging. And we've been calling on it, and Ausgrid have just released a trial tariff. So how it works, it's a volumetric tariff most of the time. And then on the days in the year where there's a really big load on the network, they can apply a critical peak tariff, which is ridiculously, insanely high. And we would not pay that because we can alert you and we can say, hey, there's a critical peak event coming up next week. Make sure you charge on Tuesday. So it's a super controllable load. Or in the worst case, we can actually throttle the station down to a decent sort of level. So we've got a very controllable loads. The loads are very rarely coincident with critical peak demand. And so what do? You have a special tariff. And that's what around the world, the North America and Europe, China have these tariffs.
And those are tariffs doing what tariffs are designed to do, which is influence behavior.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So we really would love to see, one, the Ausgrid tariff go from being a trial to being a real tariff. I'd love to see the other networks following their lead.
It's probably fair to say in the rollout of the public network, EVs and other companies' public networks, that they've played a big role in terms of grant funding.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's largely been the case in other markets around the world.
Yeah.
But I think if we truly believe that we're going to have a network for 20 million vehicles, which is how many there are in Australia, we can't be waiting on the government to fund it all. So tell us a little bit about the investment decision in terms of owning and operating a DC network. Are there structural changes that we need to see in the market for that to be, such an attractive investment decision that we start to see these really turn up everywhere?
One of the interesting things is about Australia is we started so late that we were able to avoid a lot of the mistakes made in other countries. And so we avoided the most of the plug wars. So there are different plugs that you can use to plug from the charger into your car. And in Australia, we use what's called CCS2. And most of the world uses CCS2. There is another standard that you will see in Australia called CHAdeMO. So we see probably 1% of the sessions on our network are CHAdeMO. CHAdeMO is the Japanese standard. So it is essentially being phased out. We were required to put it on our chargers during some of our early government-funded projects, but we're not really that much required to do it now. So that CHAdeMO is going away. In other parts of the world, there is what's called the North American charging standard, which is not actually a charging standard. It's just, Tesla's plug.
Yep.
And they haven't quite turned it into a standard yet, but it is being adopted in North America. And the only other country in the world that uses it is South Korea. And then otherwise in North America, they have another plug. But a few years ago, there were lots of plugs. Like when Norway started, there were like dozens of different plugs. And so they had 3 goes at their charging infrastructure. And whereas we were able to basically do it in one. So,
So there must be a lot of stranded assets in Norway and
North America. And also in North America, it's going to be North American charging is quite a mess, in many ways for many reasons, which don't really apply to Australia. Like I said, we started late. What did we get? So DC fast charging, really, the turning point in DC fast charging was tritium in 2013. The RT50. Now you might pull up and see an RT50 and go, oh, yeah, it's a bit of old kit. But that was revolutionary. At one point, that was 60% of the DC fast chargers in Norway. And that changed the game. So before that, there weren't really lots and lots of DC fast chargers. And so a lot of countries did their early electrification using AC plugs. We just skipped straight to DC. So ARENA's funding of us and ChargeFox for the highway charging, straight to DC. ARENA Future Fuels Fund, straight to DC. Most of the state government funding has been DC. So we've sort of skipped over all that, the AC stuff and the curbside stuff and so forth. And so, but also we got great cars, in the main, and increasingly cheaper cars. So we don't need as much, we haven't needed as much subsidy of the vehicles in Australia. And we're now at a point where we're getting pretty close to metropolitan charging being a self-sustaining business. Not only that you can get payback on your existing charges, but that you can fund your expansion of your network. So we're pretty close to that. And that's really driven by getting vehicles in. And so whatever the government can do, make sure that vehicles come into the country, and things like the emission standard is one of them, will help that. But there's a big difference between metropolitan charging and regional charging. And so the regions will need help. So I think that's probably where the future money needs to go. So I think, once you see the New South Wales money flow through, I think there's a bit more money coming through in Queensland and ACT, but I don't think there's much more going to come out of Victoria. But then you'll see it start to, should flow out to the regions. Now, over time, the regions will catch up in terms of utilisation. They will become economically sustainable, but it's still a few years away. And we do it we used to do it for telephone lines and electricity and broadband. And so we'll have to do that for charging as well in the regions. Yeah.
And I think probably Australia might be a little bit unique to some of the European countries where the population's a lot closer together. We've got to put chargers on the drive out to Broken Hill, and the reality is there's thousands of kilometres there to fill in.
Although if you look at, it's always fast. I've been following Norway for a while, obviously, but if you can get on the internet those things where you get a map of one country and you can superimpose it on another one. So superimpose a map of Norway on Queensland, and it's remarkably similar. They're about the same length. Everyone's down the bottom,
right? Okay.
And then it's just sort of stringy, and it just goes up it's quite patchy. And so Norway, in many ways, is quite a good analogy. And some of the other Scandinavians too, they tend to be, everyone lives at the bottom, and then it gets sort of thin.
Gets too cold.
So it's kind of similar. Years ago, I was a consultant in telecoms, and we used to always we were benchmarking the telecom networks in Australia, and we'd always pick the Scandinavians. They were the closest to Australia in terms of how you would get communications out. Yeah,
I guess we're quite fortunate in terms of rolling out the network, in terms of Australia on its transition, and possibly for yourself as running a company within that transition, that we've got all these countries that we can just kind of pick and choose what works.
Chris Mills and I jumped in a car and drove around California looking at the state of infrastructure before we started building. And it was good. And we were able the other good, we sort of from that, we came back and we actually talked to Arena and say, hey, this is what we saw. And here's what we think would work better, because they made mistakes. They made it hard for the charging networks to deploy in an economic manner. If you go to California, you're going to see charging stations in some really weird places, out the back next to the dumpsters. There were some scary places. I wouldn't charge there at 2 a.m. But a lot of that was just the product of the way that the government subsidies worked. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. We absolutely, so much benefited from the work that different state governments have done. Where we are today, we couldn't be there without the work that they've done. But I think we're now in another transition phase going forwards. Yeah.
It certainly feels like we're getting close to what Malcolm Gladwell would have called a tipping point in the EV sector.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And Bloomberg, talks about this idea of 5% of sales. So we actually hit 5% a while ago. And I think, today I was looking at some historical data from California. And so, you can see it really, for them, it was 6.7%, which is kind of where we are now. And it's kind of interesting because you sort of see it rise and rise, and then it throws it on, and then it goes zoompa like that. Yeah. So it's sort of, I don't think you can draw too many conclusions from other markets, but it is interesting. And we are the beneficiary of being able to see what's happened in Norway and in California and other places.
It's an exciting space. So I'm sure there'll be lots of entrepreneurs like yourself and other people throwing their talents into the ring, and very exciting to see what might come out the other end.
Yeah, let's get together in 12 months. And I think it'll be a very interesting discussion. Yeah.
And with that, it's probably all we've got time for today.
Great.
But we really appreciate you coming to chat with us. I'm sure everyone listening will enjoy it as well. And we'll see you in 12 months.
See you in 12 months. Thanks. It's been fun.
Great. Thanks, Paul. So that's it. And thanks for listening to this episode of the EV Charging Podcast. Brought to you, as always, by Solar Choice, Australia's only instant quote comparison service for solar, EV chargers, heat pumps, batteries, and air conditioning systems. We also provide independent consultation and tender management for clean energy projects in commercial and strata buildings with over 17 years of experience. Find out more at solarchoice.net.au and stay tuned for the next episode in 2 weeks.
If you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving us a review on your favourite podcast app, and make sure you share an episode with someone else who might like it. See you on the next one.